Uh-oh. How did we switch views again?
Oh, did it?
Yep,
Let me switch it. There we go.
there you go. Are there still people coming in, Yale?
Yeah, I'm just letting the one more person. So there's no one else in the waiting room at this time.
Okay. So if everybody doesn't mind, we can give it a couple of minutes.
So
Actually, we could,
how's the
sorry.
rest of your conference been going?
Conference. We're not a conference, you're just our webinar. We're not, conference isn't until, there's one in April and
Oh,
October.
I was thinking this is like an all-day conference and everybody's just zooming in for stuff and I'm just the presenter as part of your conference.
No, you're the presenter as the presenter.
Oh, all right.
So I'll go ahead and start with introductions and we can get started as people decide to show up as we go. So my name is Darby. I am with the board of directors with Southwest Parking and Transportation Association. Webinars have been my thing for a really long time, and finding great content is important. Emergency management is important for all of us, right? Robert Church is a member of our university, Northern Arizona University Police Department. He's been with us for, I don't know, 5, 6, 12 years, 5, there
years.
You go.
5 years next week.
And emergency management is a big part of his, I agree, go Jacks. Is part of our thing as a university. You know, we all know bad things happen at universities and schools, and it doesn't hurt to be prepared. So Robert has been in law enforcement emergency management for 30 years. He's a Navy veteran. He's a grandpa. Just kidding. I added that one in there because I know that. Let's see. We've been with the Arizona Department of Corrections, Rehabilitation and Reentry, and now he's our Director of Emergency Management. He has served in various emergency operations centers, county and state levels in roles such as public information officer, liaison officer, operations section chief, planning section chief, as well as the EOC manager. Some of the incident experience he has includes member of public information team for the Dose and Goodwin fires in Yavapai County, planning section chief for the museum fire, Raphael fire, tunnel fire, and pipeline and Haywire fire complex. Those are humongous fires, and if anybody doesn't know, humongous fires with extreme devastation in Flagstaff, Arizona. The EOC manager for Arizona Department of Corrections during several large-scale prison complex disturbances, and he also helped manage COVID-19 protocols. He's been a volunteer with Team Rubicon's a disaster relief organization serving communities that are impacted by disasters and help with the recovery process since 2016. He likes to take courses. He just recently got some gold card for emergency management. Kind of made me want to take all the tests just to have that gold card, but those tests are really hard. So a little bit of background, like I said, we like to bring a lot of really great content. However, when you think about emergency management, you think fire, you think police, you think, why didn't they show up faster? Why is everybody drowning in New Orleans? You know, you kind of think all those things until you kind of get into the weeds a little bit of, there's got to be decision makers. There's got to be boots on the ground. You have to be safe. You have to be methodical, and you have to be efficient. And not only that, you have to have materials and resources and a lot of things. So there's a whole lot more to it. Hence the more than just emergency and fire. So with that being said, and I'd also like to let you know, if anybody's got a question, You can raise your hand. Robert is a Teams guy apparently, and may or may not be okay, so I can help with asking questions, or just unmute yourself and ask the question. Is that okay with you, Robert?
Yeah, that's fine. Or if you, Darby, can monitor the chat. I mean, I've got two screens going, but I get going and I forget to look at the chat stuff too. So if something comes up in chat, feel free to do like you always do and just give me a nudge. And
I can happily do that. And with that, Robert, I'm turning it over to you and I'm going on mute.
all right. Thank you, Darby. I appreciate it. Greetings, everybody. From beautiful Flagstaff. We've had a really nice winter up here, so it's doing nice. Like Darby said, I've got quite a bit of experience. I was a former law enforcement officer before I got into the emergency management part of things, and that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about today. Is that emergency management is more than just the police and the fire response, and especially talk about some of the ways that maybe the stuff that you do in parking and transportation would roll up into that as part of an emergency response of some sort. So with that, I always start off my presentations with this, what is emergency management? We're the managerial function that helps create the framework for communities to try to reduce vulnerability and to promote safer and less vulnerable communities, and try to help those communities build, sustain, and improve their capability to respond and recover from, whether it be a natural disaster or an act of terrorism or other type of disaster. So one of the things I have in my presentation, I'm very big on reading audiobooks as part of my professional and personal development. Maybe some of you recognize Simon here. He's got a couple of books out, Start With Why and Leaders Eat Last. But the one I wanted to talk about today is The Infinite Game, the book that he put out. And he talks about the difference between the finite and the infinite mindset in how we go about doing things. And so I'm just going to let him explain. It's about a 2-minute video that kind of explains his thought process on that. And then we'll talk a little bit about why we use that in emergency management. So if you give me just a second, and I know I had it up. Where did it go? Here we go.
In the mid-1980s, Dr. Kars theorized the definition of these two types of games, finite games and infinite games. A finite game is defined as known players, fixed rules, and an agreed-upon objective. Football, baseball. There's always a beginning, middle, and an end. And if there's a winner, then necessarily there has to be a loser. Then there are infinite games. Infinite games are defined as known and unknown players, which means new players can join at any time. The rules are changeable, which means everyone can play however they want. And the objective is to perpetuate the game, to stay in the game as long as possible. Turns out, we're players in infinite games every day of our lives, whether we know it or not. There's no such thing as winning global politics. There's no such thing as winning education, right? You can come in first for the finite amount of time you're at school, where we have an agreed upon time frame, the school year, and we have agreed upon metrics, grades, but nobody wins education. Nobody's declared the winner of careers. And there's definitely no such thing as winning business. No one's declared the winner of business. But if you listen to the language of so many leaders, it becomes abundantly clear that they don't actually know the game they're playing in. They talk about being number one or being the best or beating their competition. Based on what? Based upon what agreed upon metrics, objectives, or timeframes. And this is a problem, because when we play with a finite mindset in an infinite game, when we play to win or be the best in a game that has no finish line, there are some predictable and consistent outcomes. The big ones include the decline of trust, the decline of cooperation, and the decline of innovation. And so we have to learn to play for the game that we are in. If you're playing a game of baseball, show up with a finite mindset, play to win. If you have a new client, right, that you're trying to pitch, or there is a winning, there's a beginning, middle, and end. And when the client makes the decision to choose you or choose somebody else, then that game has concluded. But if you win the client, if you gain a new client, now you have to convert. Now it's about the infinite game. There's no winning anymore. Now it's about making sure that the client is happy and that they stay in the game with you for as long as possible. And we have to adjust our mindset to play for the game that we're in. And unfortunately, a lot of business leaders do not play for the game that they're in. In the mid-1980s, Dr. Kars theorized the definition.
Give me a second, pull this back up. So, and the reason I bring this up is because emergency management rarely has the resources that they directly control. And so therefore we're responsible for the coordination of other operational resources. So we have to build trusting teams. We have to collaborate and cooperate with the internal and external partners. And many times we have to be innovative in our approach in solving problems. We have to have that infinite mindset because emergency management is about the infinite game, right? Because we're always looking to move forward with what it is that we're doing. So another book I have is General McChrystal's book, Team of Teams. And so really what we're looking for is in emergency management is we're the team that's building and managing other teams, right? So I don't control the resources. If we have something going on, for instance, Darby and her area oversees parking and transit, right? I'm bringing that team in to help with whatever it is that we're doing. So we've got an incident, we're managing some type of community assistance center here on campus. I need those other partners that have those teams to come in and be part of that. So emergency management doesn't control the resources, but I like to say we kind of herd the cats, right? We're trying to get the other teams engaged and being able to help us. And so this is why I look at emergency management as that infinite game, because we're constantly going through that emergency planning cycle. We're looking for opportunities to enact mitigation. So like up here in Flagstaff, a lot of places, communities will have wildfire mitigation. So getting rid of all that burnable material as part of living in the community, being prepared. So doing training and exercises and being able to prepare and making sure that our systems work. We get to that response part. That's where the police and fire part come in, right? They respond to the emergency, but we have other partners we have to bring with us to help stabilize that incident, to help preserve property, maybe setting up evacuations and shelters and mass care and things of that nature. And then the recovery piece. And this is always the piece that gets kind of left behind sometimes. The lights and sirens, we've managed everything, but now we're in the recovery phase. I came here 5 years ago. I came 2 weeks after a very substantial snowstorm that went to a governor's declaration as an emergency. So I was already behind the 8 ball when I got here. And we're still working through that recovery process. I'm still waiting to go through the final audit with the state 5 years later to try to recover the money that we spent being able to respond to this emergency. And it's much more than just police and fire. We're getting reimbursement for transit and parking and for facilities and for damages and stuff. So we're just constantly working through that cycle. And that's why I look at emergency management as that infinite game. We just don't create the plans and forget about them. We go to training, we practice, and we keep working that process. So the way we approach emergency management is through the whole community approach, and it's the means by which residents and emergency practitioners, community leaders, government officials collectively understand and assess the needs of their respective communities and determine the best ways to organize and strengthen their assets, their capabilities, and their interests. And so by doing so, we become more efficient and resilient to being able to rebuild. And in a sense, whole community is a philosophical approach on how we think about conducting emergency management. So I'll walk you through a typical timeline. Left of boom, before the incident occurs, we're doing that pre-incident planning, developing plans, increasing capacity with equipment purchases, maybe doing some training and some exercising of personnel, and then boom, the incident hits. We get that disruption to critical services. We start to send resources to stabilize the incident, and we're going to talk about these phases right here as we move forward. So resources get in there, they stabilize the whatever's going on, protecting lives, stopping the dying, stopping the damage to the environment. And we start to work through those short-term solutions for stabilization. And then as we get through that, we move into recovery, which a lot of times becomes long-term. Maybe there's some permanent solutions that we develop. But like I talked about, recovery could take hours, it could be days, it could be weeks, it could be months, it could be years. I'm trying to remember what the case was off the top of my head in a class I just recently had, but there was a major disaster. It might have been a flood event that the federal government, 17 years, and they just now finally closed out that because it's gone through all the claims process and the audits and the lawsuits and everything out. So recovery can easily take a long time, and that's the part that a lot of times we forget about. And it's all about the planning and how we respond and document stuff to be able to get to that recovery piece. And that was one of the challenges I talked about when I came into this, because I hadn't had those conversations with my campus partners ahead of time. They really didn't know how to document everything. So we had to kind of go back after the fact and say, all right, let's see these time cards, let's see these, go through the policy, and we had to reconstruct it going backwards to be able to get to where we were able to start recovering some money from that. So as part of the whole community concept, the National Response Framework uses what we call 15 emergency support functions, and they describe the different types of resources and assistance that's available. And as you can see, it's much more than just firefighting and public safety. And I would imagine that for some of you, you can probably see in these where your organization or your operational area may fall into one or several of these different emergency support functions. And then FEMA came out with this a couple of years ago called Community Lifelines, and they're introduced to help prioritize the restoration and revitalization of critical services following an impactful emergency or disaster. So it organizes and aligns critical services into these 7 lifelines. They just recently changed it. I understand it. I think they're adding another one. So it's going to be 8. And they provide outcome-based survivor-centric frame of reference that assists leadership and responders by developing and prioritizing objectives when responding to the situation. So to give you an example, police and fire services is important, right, for safety. But if we've lost the ability to communicate and people can't call 911 or not, the dispatchers can't talk to police and fire, that prioritizes that communications services has to be restored before we can do these features over here. Or maybe some highway and transportation stuff has to be restored before we can start opening up a shelter and moving people there. So it helps a community prioritize the response, because when something happens, everybody starts to get overwhelmed, and you don't want to be making decisions in a vacuum, and you really got to be able to quickly bring people together to prioritize the objectives and where you're going to put your resources to respond to the incident. So the framework that we use for that is called the National Incident Management System, and it guides community stakeholders on how to prepare and manage incidents. It doesn't matter how big or how small. Doesn't matter if it's a simultaneous incident. You can use it for pre-planning for special events. We use it here at the university for commencement. We used it recently when we had the Vice President of the United States on campus to visit. So you can do pre-event planning with it as well as responding to emergencies. And it provides the participants with shared vocabulary, systems and processes, and how to respond to emergencies. So everybody's talking the same language, understanding who's responsible for what, and making sure that everything is the same in terms of how you're going to communicate and do things. So this one's pretty self-explanatory. I like this slide. Give you a second to digest that one. It tells you what NIMS is and what NIMS is not. So some of you familiar with some of the applications there, like the Incident Command System, which we'll talk about in a moment. NIMS is not just the Incident Command System. It's a comprehensive approach, systematic approach, and how we identify threats and hazards and how we're going to move through the mission areas of the cycle of emergency management to be able to prepare for things and then respond to things. Like I said, it's not only for large scale incidents. Actually, if you use it for pre-planned events, it gives people the opportunity to exercise, right? Usually in a low stress type of environment, maybe high stress. Commencement is a pretty high activity here, but there's no life-threatening emergency that's happening. So it gives people the opportunity to practice, right? Just like working out. So that way, when they actually have to do it in a larger emergency, they've got an idea and concept and how to go about doing that and use it successfully. So some of its components, it's designed to provide, like I said, command and coordination, how to manage your resources, how to manage information and communications about the event. So you've got the public information piece. And we do this through being flexible, having standardized processes, and unity of effort, right? So you get everybody on the same page. This is what we're going for. Here's how we're going to do it. Making sure that the effort is not wasted, that you don't have duplication of effort. And that happens sometimes. You have two areas, silo thinking, right? They've both recognized the problem. Maybe they're driving outside their lane to try to solve it, but now you've got duplication of effort, and that's a mismanagement of resources, and we don't want that. So again, some of the components of NIMS and use of the incident command system is that common terminology, management by objectives. So when we're managing a large incident like a wildfire, from the EOC, we'll have that conversation with the incident management team. They start plotting out on the map, and they'll say, once it hits this management action point here, we're going to do these actions, right? So we might have to start a burnout phase because it's reached this point where if we don't burn out this section of the fire, it'll keep running and it's going to go destroy homes. So we start setting up those objectives. It helps to come up with a manageable span of control. So keeping it 5 to 7 people, unless you're running a task force of some sort that maybe it's all the same element. And how do you establish and transfer command? What is unified command? We'll talk about that in a moment. And then how do you dispatch and deploy resources and be able to keep track of those resources? And I'll show you some stuff with that here shortly as well. So another book that I really like about managing crisis is Extreme Ownership. It's a leadership philosophy that emphasizes taking responsibility, not micromanaging, but taking responsibility of every aspect of a team and its mission, making sure that they have the tools and materials and the personnel to do what it is that you're asking the team to do. It's based on the idea that blaming others for problems prevents them from getting solved, right? We just want to be able to solve the problem. But by accepting blame and taking steps to fix the situation, it helps to move the mission forward. And so extreme ownership can help teams boost productivity by improving communication, prioritizing among team members. It allows them to recognize what needs to be done, make a decision, and execute it. And these are some of the author's thoughts. And, I start off when I'm working with our emergency management teams here on campus, the way we have it divided out. One of the first things is you got to relax. Right? You got to look around, find out what's going on, assess the situation, and you're going to have to start making some decisions, And so it helps you to prioritize your problems, look at them, what is the highest priority problem, and start working a solution for that problem. If you try to solve everything at one time, it's not going to happen. Plus, you might not be able to solve one situation until you've solved a different situation. So like if we have 20 power poles drop across San Francisco here on campus, I got to get the power poles removed, but before I can do that, I got to make sure that the power is shut off. I got to communicate with APS and get them in here to make sure that they're de-energized before I can start removing poles. So for right now, we're not moving traffic on there. So it helps you to prioritize what you're going to be able to do.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely, Darby.
Mostly because we all know I like to ask questions. What does it look like if you have got somebody in the power position or the operations, your supervisory level position that is not able to delegate or let go and trust somebody else to do responsible? And they are the micromanager. So they're automatically going to, what does that look like in this book if you have that as the individual making the decision?
It's difficult.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get where you're going, because you're right. There's some folks that they can't let go. They have to micromanage every decision. And so one of the things with using the incident command system is we put, and I'll talk about it here in a moment, we put people in specific roles. Sometimes their day-to-day title goes away because they're managing a different aspect of what we're doing. But it makes it very, very difficult because you really want to empower folks to be able to, especially your boots on the ground folks, you give them what your objectives are, they can look at it, and they need to start making decisions. Because if we try to run everything up to the top of the chain and back down again, people get hurt or injured, damage continues to happen. And so we really want to try to break away from that. And so that can absolutely be a challenge. And so with that, actually, I'm moving into that part right now. So it's the leader's responsibility to create the vision of what it is that we're going to be doing, to develop those operational objectives. And we call that the leader's intent. So basically the leader says, here's what I want to see accomplished. These are the goals and objectives. Here's our management action points. You kind of have an idea of what it is that I want to see us accomplish. So that helps team members understand what the objectives are so they can execute decisions in what we call absence of orders, right? We've entrusted them to go out and do the things that they know that they need to do to meet those objectives. Don't run everything up and down. So for example, when I worked for the Department of Corrections and I took over radio services when I was the emergency manager, one of the first things I talked about with my staff was we had 16 prisons across the state that have radio services, and I told them, you know, when you go in there and you see that something's not right, and you know that it needs to be fixed, you're empowered to fix it. You don't have to come back to me for a decision. So I equipped all 3 trucks with the same tools, same equipment, same cabling, everything else, so that when they went out there to service something and they saw, well, it was more than what was reported to us and this needs to be fixed, I've given you the equipment, I've given you the tools, I've given you the vision, just do it. You know what needs to be done. You now know that it's a problem, fix it for them. I don't want to have to send you back out there because they discover, well, there was more of a problem than what we were led to believe. So I just empowered them to be able to do that. And that's what we're talking about when we're empowering teams. We don't wait for someone to tell us what to do. So high performing small teams are built on trust, and that can be difficult sometimes in getting that trust built up with those leaders. But if we're going to resolve the crisis successfully, that's what we've got to be able to do. And so that gets us back to General McChrystal and talking about, you know, efficiency is doing the things the correct way, you know, doing them right, but effectiveness is doing the right thing. And so when we're responding to an emergency, we want to make sure that what we're doing is being effective and that we're doing the right things at the right time to be sure we are taking care of our community members and being able to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I approach managing a crisis. So, you know, when we're looking at our day-to-day operations, we clearly know what we're doing. We know what the knowns are. We kind of operate in this little simple area, right? This is what we do day to day. We kind of go about it and we get things done. But when a crisis hits and unusual circumstances, things start to become a little more unclear. We're not quite sure what it is that we need to implement. And so they start to become a little complicated, and they might start breaking off into different complicated issues. And as that situation grows, it now starts to become complex. And so we need to have an agile approach in how we do things, and making sure that decision-making process needs to become agile so that problems can be quickly identified. And the earlier we can do that and more effectively enact those solutions, the better we're going to be in trying to make sure that that complex doesn't reach chaotic. And so that's kind of where we live in the emergency management world, right? Is we're preparing and stuff. We've got plans, and then once something starts to break loose, it starts to get a little complicated. We got to start putting those teams together, managing those teams, because this might become very complex. And what we don't want is to get to a chaotic state that we're not able to control it. And so it's through that use of existing high performance and trusting teams that we can achieve that. So it brings us to another book that I really like. And in this one, I recommend for building an understanding of how to lead during a crisis. So using real world examples, it demonstrates how someone can unexpectedly be thrust into leadership, and how all of a sudden they've got to step up and be in charge of everything. And it might not necessarily be their job. And so some of the examples they use are the Boston Marathon. Nobody calls me, and now my phones are like going off the hook as I'm trying to do a presentation. I don't get it. So as an example, the Boston Marathon, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the events of September 11th and others. And while these are extreme examples, they give you some context on as to how these folks all of a sudden found themselves in the limelight. They had to step up and they had to be leaders and manage the situation. So hopefully, from that perspective, none of us will have to manage something that's quite as big as those, but it does give you some good ideas on how to prepare yourself. It uses the meta leadership format, if you're familiar with that, and what to be able to do when a crisis hits. So I've reading this for like the second or third time because I always get something else out of it. But that's another book that I recommend. So with that, what I did is I took some of the elements of that book, because I do audio books, right? So I don't have all the graphics, and I took some of the elements from the community lifelines that we saw earlier, and I kind of created this graphic, and I use this working with my emergency management teams here at NAU. When a crisis strikes, the authors talk about, we go to what we call basement thinking, right? We'll go into survival mode, panic mode. We start making reactionary decisions, emotional decisions that aren't necessarily based on data. And so what we need to do is quickly realize we're operating in the basement and we need to get out of the basement as quickly as possible. So that's where you gather your team up, right? Get them together. You start asking questions, obtaining a situational awareness. It talks about taking a breath, or, let's walk on this. Let's look at this for a second. Let's, maybe we're taking a walk around, sizing up the situation. What are our tools, our processes, our checklists? We get in that workroom and we start working the problem. And then from that, we quickly want to move into what we call as the laboratory. And that's where we start executing those decisions. We look at them for effectiveness and we refine and we adjust so that we can make sure that we're putting forth our best effort. So again, it's in that continuous improvement loop. We're identifying stuff, new information's coming in. Hey, are what we doing? Are these the right things that we should be doing? Do we need to change direction on how we're doing something? So for me, this is a good tool that I use quite a bit with my team and getting them to remember where we need to be. And, that's why we do all the pre-planning and put together checklists and processes so we can effectively start executing those in an emergency situation. So who are some of the non-traditional responders? We always think about the police and fire, but what about transportation services? What about setting up a shelter? What about a tow truck or utilities or things like a backhoe? What are some situations, I want you guys to kind of think to yourself, what are some situations where these non-traditional responders might be called in? Do you already have contracts in place for some of these responders, or are you expected in your operational area to be the one that supplies those resources? So do you have contracts already in place? Can you project what your potential costs are? Does your operation have plans developed on how these resources might be used? Do you know what type of resources are and how to track them in an emergency so that you can get reimbursed in a federal or state declared disaster? So I'm going to give you some resources. So do you know the difference between what a type 1 sweeper is and what a type 4 sweeper is, what their capacities are? These different capacities. So if somebody says, I need a type 1 sweeper, this is what they're expecting you to send them. They're not expecting you to send them this over here. Or what about the difference between a type 1 bus and a type 4 bus? I've asked for a type 1 bus where I can seat 40 or more people. You send me a type 4. Well, I guess I'm going to need 2 type 4s to be able to do the work of a type 1. And so it shows you what the resources are, what their capabilities are. So that way, when people are asking for resources, you know what it is that you're getting. So the way you find that out is the Type 3 Forces Definition Guide. So this is put out by FEMA. That previous slide I showed you, that's where those definitions come out. I just copied and pasted and dropped it in the PowerPoint, but you can go in there and find out what are your resources, how are they typed, what are their capabilities, and then this is the important part, the schedule of equipment rates. And so, which, it probably isn't going to let me do it from that screen right there. So let me pull this up really quick. There we go. Let me drop down here. Yeah, it's not gonna, oh, there we go. So can you guys see that? Darby, I can see you. Give me a heads up You can see it, okay. So the equipment rates, you can go in there and you can download it and it will tell you what the reimbursement rate is. So one of the things we started working on here at the university before the winter is identifying what types of resources we have, what is the cost code? So then that way you've got that in there, and then what does that reimbursement rate go to? So if you've already typed your equipment, you already know what the cost code is, you know what the reimbursement is, you can start planning on what is this actually costing us and what might we be able to get reimbursed from. And the state audit isn't too bad. FEMA audit is, they go through it with a fine tooth comb, right? So if you're missing any of those elements, they could kick it back, or they're going to say, we're not going to reimburse it. So, you know, one of the challenges we had with the snow part is we didn't have any, I'm trying to remember, and Darby will correct me if I'm incorrect, but we didn't have a way on how we track the buses in who was operating what bus and mileage, right? Because with vehicles, they want mileage. And so we don't have any like pre-trip tickets and post tickets where they're tracking mileage and stuff. But they gave us some exceptions because it was a state one, not a federal one, where we were able to show fuel and the runtime of the buses. So the buses, you know, how many hours it operated and things like that. So we found some ways to get around that. With reimbursement for personnel, it's based on overtime, but we use student labor to help shovel out the bus stops and stuff. So I took it from the approach, well, that's contracted labor. They're not regular full-time employees, so they will never reach a threshold of working overtime. But what's the difference if I use student labor on a contract or I bring in a company to contract and do that? And they're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's in your policy. We'll take that. And so it's understanding how you can use that and have that stuff worked out ahead of time so that when you do have an emergency, you're able to track those costs and be able to document what it is that you did, how you used them, and then be able to recover those costs. Oh, darn it. I
And
apologize.
for some of, just to add to that, for some of that particular situation, wasn't some of it, I've got equipment, facilities has equipment, various people have equipment, and it's all different types of equipment that fall into different categories. So you also kind of have to know who has what, who used what for how long, and all that other fun stuff.
Absolutely. And that was one of the challenges, right? Is who's got equipment, how did they use it, and being able to document the work. And so to the point that you need to be able to tie on that this person, Darby, drove this vehicle, truck number 123, for 6 hours to remove snow. She was here for 8 hours, but the first hour was doing other administrative stuff, and then the last hour was doing administrative stuff. So for 6 hours, she drove that bus to do that particular job, and then that way it can get reimbursed. So talk a little bit about the incident command system and what we use, you know, so building that team to be able to lead other teams. So the incident command system, or commonly called ICS, is the process we use. And this is just going to be a very high introduction to you guys. Some of you may be familiar with it and how it works. I'm not trying to teach it to you today, but I just want you to have awareness. So it starts with the incident commander, commonly called the IC. And these are your command and general staff positions. Each one of them has a very distinct role and responsibility. And so basically the PIO, the public information officer, they're the ones responsible for putting information out, right? Information comes in, they're telling your audience what we're doing, what the situation is, what they should do. Should they shelter in place? Do they need to evacuate? That safety officer is making sure that everything you're doing is in a safe manner and that it's meeting safety standards. The incident commander is in charge, but the safety officer actually has the power to shut something down. So for example, they're going in there, they're trying to dig a trench to be able to stop a leaky gas line. But the safety officer notices, hey, you're not following trenching protocols for safety for people down in the trench. This operation stops right here, and you need to bring in the materials that you need to do to do that safely. So they can override a decision if it's not done in a safe manner. That liaison officer, they may be contacting and working with other response agencies or other partners. And then ops, planning, logistics, and finance are pretty straightforward. You know, the planning section, they plan for stuff to get done. Operations, they get the stuff done. Logistics finds the stuff to get the stuff done, and finance and administration, they track the stuff and figure out how they're going to pay for the stuff. So, you know, it's very basic starting out. If you've got lots of other entities responding, whether they be operational entities or jurisdictional partners, then you might go to a unified system, a unified command, where those representatives are working in a unified manner to be able to make decisions as a single command element, but you still have those command and general staff roles as well. And so talk a little bit about what that looks like, you know, as the incident expands, then you can start to break out other modules that might need to be done. So usually at like the county EOC, when we're managing the wildfires, the type 1 team that comes in to manage the fire, they'll get bigger than this. Us at the EOC, we usually don't get much bigger than this right here. Maybe sometimes we'll bring in a resource unit, or we might bring in a time and comp unit to do some of the documentation. So it really just depends on how complex your incident is and the personnel that you have available to be able to manage it. So that's the nice thing about ICS. You can expand and contract based on the needs of the incident. Excuse me, and I'll kind of wrap this up with the training component. So my recommendation, right, if you're going to be a response partner in some way because you're bringing resources to something, whether it be tow trucks or buses or something else, is all the personnel who are responding and be part of that incident, at the very least, they should take what's called IS 100, IS 700. These are independent study online classes. Darby even got them done and was successful in completing. So I know if Darby can do it, anybody can do it. But it helps you build awareness, right? If you've got folks who are going to be in a leadership responsibility, they should take the 800 and the 200. The thing to remember is these 4 right here make the basis of being able to do any other advanced class. So my recommendation is if you just have people do all 4 of them and an opportunity comes available where they can take some of these in-person classes, then they're already set for success because they don't have to worry about it, because those are always going to be prerequisites for those classes. Another good one is this one right here called the 191 EOC ICS interface class. So basically that's taking the on-scene personnel and the emergency operations center personnel and teaching them how do they communicate with each other, because the on-scene people are managing the incident. The EOC is supporting them. So if they say, hey, I need somebody to contact APS and I need 2 trucks out here to do the EOC is going to get that. The on-scene folks are just, they're not going to make those calls, right? They're managing stuff on scene. They're going to reach back to the EOC and say, hey, get me these resources. These are what I need. So that's another really good class. My favorite though, and then you can do advanced training where you're taking specific classes just to do planning section chief. So that's like a 4 or 5 day class, or public information officer, 2 to 3 day class. My favorite one, though, is the All Hazards Incident Management Team, the 305 class. It's a 5-day class, and you have the opportunity to work through all those command and general staff positions with folks at a class. So you really get a basis of understanding of what each of those roles does, and you can quickly figure out which ones work for you, which ones don't. I'm not a logistics guy, and I'm not a finance guy, but I'll do ops, IC, PIO, and planning any day of the week. Those are my 4 major skill sets, but you don't want me to be the one that's like tracking and saying that stuff's getting paid for, because that's not my skill set. It's my wife, she's the accountant. So those are some really good training opportunities. I'm not sure, so Southwest, so I imagine we have folks from California and New Mexico as well as Arizona. Check with your state emergency management group, and they'll be able to tell you when they deliver these in-person classes. And you're eligible to go to those if you decide that you want to go. I've done classes where I have people who are not emergency managers, non-responders, doing that. So this is the template that I use. So working with my emergency management teams here on campus, I'm able to record when they took these classes. It's all part of my documented training record. And you can see some of these, any of those IS classes, those are independent study classes. You have one specifically for public works role in emergencies. coordination between water and wastewater. So when I was still a police officer, I actually took a two-day class on water and wastewater management. It's not my skill set, but you know what? It helped me understand what their role is in responding to an emergency. So there are definitely some classes that could be very specific for your audience here today. Here's another list of a more comprehensive list of some of those. And again, those are all free. You can take them online. You go to the Emergency Management Institute. So let me find that really quick so I can click on that. I'll take you to that page real quick so you can see it. It has a list of all the classes. So what you would have to do is you just have to create a student ID, and then you take the classes, and then there's a test, and you have to be able to take the test. And so Darby, you want to talk a little bit about your recent experience in doing that?
Absolutely, it was the best. So I was going to ask a question based on that
Yeah.
experience. So, the first course I took was, I think, the 100, the first one, the 100 level.
Right.
I took that test 14 times after, it probably was 12, but may have been 14. And I was very frustrated. Luckily, it'll let you take it over and over and over again. But I reread, I took, I did all the things, and I had to get into kind of a groove. Obviously, once I got into that groove, it was easier to do. So here was my question while I was going to explain to you how badly I took the test first time. I did not the next 3 courses, but the first one was horrific. Oh my goodness, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, no, I didn't. How do you know? So I took the first 4 courses, and we do incident command probably on a non-emergent level for our commencement, right? So we do a lot of it. We've done some other stuff in probably a not as formal capacity during 9/11 and some of the things that we had happen, with the protesting and the different things over the years here on campus. So commencement has become more of an incident management style. And some of those tests and some of those courses, honestly, on a high level makes sense, but it's very confusing and it's a whole lot of information if you've never done it. Do
Right.
you get more experience? Just because you took a test doesn't mean you actually know what you're doing. It just means
No.
you passed a test.
Right.
So as you get through the series and the incidents and the different things, and you're in the different roles, once you find your strength, are you just the worker bee? Are you better there? Does all of the platforms make more sense is my question.
Yeah, I think so. When I first started as a police officer, I had to take the 100 and 200. And again, this is stuff that came about as a result of the failures of the events of September 11th, right? We didn't have the standardized system. People use different terminology. So for example, when you're talking to a firefighter and you say you need a tanker, their thought is you need an air tanker. But what you really want is a water tender, then you got to say water tender. And in the East Coast, they don't call for an ambulance and EMS, they'll call for a buggy, right? It's a slang term that they use. And you'd have people working with them, they're like, what in the world is a buggy? What are we on the Amish farm? I need a horse and buggy. What are you talking about? No, it's an ambulance. So, we've really tried to bridge that gap and standardize those terms. So as I progressed in my career in law enforcement, I took the 300 and the 400 class, and I took a PIO class and whatnot, and really started to expand my knowledge, because I knew when I got done with law enforcement, my post career, I wanted to do emergency management. So I have found that it's like anything. The more reps you get, the more you're around using the terminology, the more that you're doing those skill sets, the easier it becomes. And it is a challenge because we have a very limited capacity in which folks like Darby on campus are exposed to this and be able to do it, because we just have some events that we do occasionally and do stuff with. But I can tell you that if you don't have a plan, if you're not working this, like when the vice president came, everything kind of went south really, really quick. So what happened is she landed at the Flagstaff Airport. They no sooner had said she's landed at the Flagstaff Airport. Well, we get people reporting on the radio. Power has gone out at the venue where the vice president is supposed to be in 10 minutes. The power is actually out all the way across North Campus. So now the Secret Service is getting all the buzz because they're like, is this a terrorist attack? And so we're reaching out to APS, and we failed in that respect. We failed to plan that event with our APS partners. And now that we've had the after action, they're all about, yeah, you've got something like that in the future, we will send somebody to your EOC, because we're trying to call APS, figure out what's going on. They knew that we had the vice president coming, so they enacted their protocols in terms of where they staged people in case something like this happened, but we didn't have that connectivity because we didn't plan with them. So in the future, we'll make sure that we plan with them to be able to do that. And they quickly got power restored, and we were able to feed back to the Secret Service. Yeah, we're in contact with APS. They're working the problem. It doesn't look like it's nefarious. It looks like for some reason, something at the wrong time, and it was a part failed at the wrong moment. It failed. It just decided the vice president's coming. I don't want to work anymore. And that's all it was. It wasn't a terrorist incident at all. So, an example of why it's important to identify those partners and make sure they're part of your planning process. So I know we're coming up to the top of the hour. I'm slotted for the hour. So I want to take a moment. And does anyone have any examples of how your organization might be using any of these concepts? We talked about what we do here. Are there some challenges, failures, suggestions, any unanswered questions? So I'm just going to open it up. Feel free to just, open up the mic and let's have a little bit of discussion before we wrap it up.
Hey, Robert, I can pop in. I am in small town Estes Park, Colorado, and we, have wildfires and floods and things just like good old Flagstaff. And we're going to go through the TEEX, I guess it's Texas A&M's emergency responses. Yeah, TEEX. And one of the things that I'd love you to talk about a little bit is tabletop exercises. I'm assuming you do those as part of this, where you go through those scenarios, and folks may not be familiar with those, but those are a great tool.
Yeah, I can talk about that, Dan. Thanks for bringing that up. So the process that we use for exercising, right? We can have discussion-based exercises, which it could be a workshop, right? Where we're just having discussion. We did one of those on campus last year for our community assistance center piece. So it's just getting to know who are the people in the plan, who are the people in the community that you could reach out to. How do you start putting that plan together? So the idea with tabletops is you've got a plan, you have the players at the table, and you work through scenario-based stuff just on a discussionary. So it's like, all right, this has happened. Dana, how would you guys go about opening up your community assistance center for your community? And Dana and his team are going to say, well, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to contact this leadership person to be able to get permission. We already have a location identified. It would take us approximately 3 hours to activate people and get them in there to start setting it up. And then our Red Cross shelter partners are going to come in. So they're going to articulate that plan. And then that's when you have the opportunity to look at stuff and say, kind of poke holes in it. So an example I'll use is when I was working with the Department of Corrections, we did a tabletop exercise with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office if they had to evacuate their jail. So understand the difference between jail and prison. Jail is usually before their case is adjudicated. Prison is they've been adjudicated, they're going to serve a certain amount of time. And so the Arizona Department of Corrections has a juvenile facility. So these are juveniles who have been adjudicated. And you have to keep those populations separate. You cannot combine pre-adjudication with adjudicated sentenced inmates. So when we were talking through the exercise with Maricopa County in being able to bring inmates, we would give you a whole wing where you would put your juvenile detainees, right? But the Arizona Department of Corrections juvenile, you are not allowed to have any weapons in there. So that includes pepper spray, tasers, any of that. It's forbidden by state statute. So when we're going through the exercise, we told them, when you bring your transport vehicles, you're going to have to lock all of your weapons in your vehicles. Well, we don't have capability for that. Well, then you can't come onto campus because we don't have capability to lock them up because they're not allowed, and we don't even allow weapons on campus, so we can't even lock your weapons up. So that's a great thing to discover in a tabletop exercise, not during an emergency when all of a sudden you got to try to figure it out. So as a result, the sheriff's office went back and they made sure that they put weapons lockers in their transport vehicles because they would have to secure their weapons when they bring their detainees onto the campus for the Department of Corrections. So I hope that kind of answers your question, what we're doing with tabletops. And then from that, you do functional and full-scale exercises where you're actually doing the stuff that you say that you're going to do. You're moving resources, you're simulating action. So it's kind of the stepping process that we use for doing exercises.
Great, thanks.
You bet. Other questions or comments? See, that's why I hate this part of the presentation because I can't see any of you. So I don't know if everybody has fallen asleep or anything else. I can't get the head nods or anything else. But by all means, if there's something unanswered, please speak up and I can clarify it for you. Or if anybody has any examples of how your organization might be using some of these concepts we talked about.
I can say NAU's been using plain language for a very long time prior to incident command. Sadly, some of our wonderful police people like to make an example of me because I forgot my call sign, usually at commencement. So they went to plain names so that they didn't have to just yell at me over the radio. Because, I actually am quite competent, just FYI. But I wasn't in my normal radio call number. So to hear a different call number, I wasn't listening for it. I wasn't.
Right.
When we switched, and this was probably seriously in 05 or 06, we did this and went to plain English because most people use the 10 codes, but a lot of us on campus use students. So the 10 codes or the alphabet were military. And that's a different code than the police 10 code. So it gets a little wonky when somebody's, or you haven't really learned the 10 code and your Y is yellow or Yosemite or something. Your brain has to stop and take a minute to kind of follow what it was that was happening. So plain English we've been doing plain English for a long time, just to make sure that anybody that's not familiar with the 10 codes or the alphabet or anything like that can get what they need to across.
Yep. And that's especially important with us because we bring in our regional partners. And so our series of call signs for our police officers are different than Flagstaff. They're different than Williams. And so we don't know who the players are by call sign. So we make it simple based on your assignment. So if you're traffic control at Lone Pine and San Francisco, that's what we're going to call out. Incident commander is going to call out to traffic at Lone Tree and Pine Knoll. What's your status? So we're not trying to figure out whose call number is what. So that's one of the things about ICS is when you go to that process and have that interoperability, like Darby said, you want to drop the 10 codes and go to plain English.
So I think we're about out of time. If everybody else has any questions, Julie just threw something in the chat. If you would like to step in there, Julie, go for it. If not, on behalf of our president.
I just wanted to remind everybody about the swap to mid-year and don't forget to register. And thank you so much for your presentation today. So
you're welcome.
I see several of our members here and hopefully they've got some folks sending us over to Durango. So
I'll drop my email in the chat.
And Dana, we can get it for you if you'd like as well.
And
Got it, thanks.
And I was going to try to give Darby the presentation to pass out to everybody, but the file was too big. But if anybody's interested, just email me and I'll find a way to trim down some of the stuff in the file so that I can get that to you. Especially if what you're wanting is any of the links that I have in the file. I find a way to do that. But yeah, just send me an email and I'll find a way to condense that down for you.
Excellent. Robert, thank you for your time. It's been amazing.
Thanks for the invite, Darby. I appreciate it. We're ready for some commencement now in a couple of weeks.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time.
Everybody have a great day.